Hello and welcome. Currently, due to some higher load at my daily work, I am unfortunately not able to invest quite as much time in my hobby as I would like. But I still try to use my spare time as much as possible to work on some retro projects. And today's video is not about a repair or a DIY, but more as a video report about an upgrade of one of my retro machines. Maybe you saw my video about this Windows XP machine which I built for gaming and experiments some time ago. If you remember, I used a socket 754 mainboard model K8V-MX/S by Asus. Actually a quite nice mainboard of its time, but it has some flaws. You can take a look at the previous video for details, but in short, first of all, the onboard network card had some kind of driver issues under Windows XP. I could work around that problem using an additional PCI network card, but still it was kind of a bummer. And the second and more annoying issue was that the VIA VT8237 South bridge has a bug which prevents SATA 2 and SATA 3 drives from working on this board. It works just fine with SATA 1 drives, and the ones which can be enforced to work in the SATA 1 mode using a jumper, but from time to time I would like to use this SSD on this machine, and this is my standard disk with Linux pre-installed with a lot of tools for hardware tests and development, which I am using on my 64-bit machines quite often. And it was a shame that I couldn't use it on this machine as well. However, I wanted to have a fast AGP system, and this was what I had at hand, and otherwise this PC was quite fast and stable. I didn't want to spend too much money on it, so I used it with all its limitations as is. But one day a member of DOS Reloaded DE community offered some mainboards, and among others there was an ASRock 939A8X-M. This socket 939 board woke up my interest, since accidentally I had an AMD Athlon 64 3200 Plus CPU at hand, which would fit, and otherwise this board has also AGP and even promised to have more features and no SATA bugs like the other one. So I decided to give it a try and bought this mainboard. Well, as I mentioned, it is designed for the socket 939 CPUs and supports everything up to 64FX and even X2 dual-core Athlon 64s. As I said, I'm going to use an Athlon 64 3200 Plus, which I have in my stash. The board is built around the ULI 1689 chipset and is not the fastest, but should be reliable and at least not as buggy as the competition. It has 4 slots of up to 4 GB of dual-channel DDR400 memory. The socket 754 boards, like the one which I had before, don't support dual-channel memory, and especially the one which I had could take only 2 modules for a total maximum of 2 GB. Let's be honest, with some lightweight Linux setup, such a machine with 4 GB would be usable even today, but 2 GB of RAM is simply too low for the modern internet and daily usage. What else? Very important for me was to have an 8X AGP port and SATA, which would be compatible with a modern SSD, as well as IDE and floppy connectors to have a good compatibility to the retro world. All the other stuff is secondary, I guess. Well, the network is obviously important, but the onboard sound will not be used by me anyway. Maybe you remember from the first build video of this machine how important it was back in the days to have a dedicated sound card. Not only because of the audio quality, but also performance. So in this machine I will definitely continue to use a dedicated sound card. I will take a shortcut here. I swapped the main boards and the replacement board worked flawlessly. I mean, really, absolutely everything worked out of the box. I just reinstalled Windows XP once again to have a clean setup. The network, the SSD on the SATA port, everything just worked. The first positive thing which I noticed was that the layout of this board was a much better fit for this case, since the ATX connector was not squeezed under the CD drive anymore and hanging over the CPU cooler. Now it was on the opposite side of the CPU and completely out of the way. But with all the positive news, unfortunately there must be always something what spoils the experience, isn't it? Well, unfortunately this board has again one very annoying issue. Although it has a CPU temperature sensing and CPU fan tachometer, it has absolutely no fan speed control. And so it blows with a full speed all the time, making every shutdown of this PC a relief. So currently turning this PC off makes me actually happier than turning it on. It is absolutely unusable without an additional fan control, which I would like to add as soon as possible. But let's take a look at one issue I had, which is actually not related to the mainboard itself. As I said, this ASRock board is made for the socket 939 CPUs, and now I could use an Athlon 64 3200 Plus, which should be an upgrade over the socket 754 Athlon 64 3000 Plus, which I used before. Furthermore, this mainboard supports dual mode DDR400 memory, and so I used 2x 1GB DDR400 memory modules from G.Skill, which don't only look fancy but should also be quite fast. The memory clock in the BIOS was set to 200 MHz, or DDR400 effectively. Everything was fine and I was expecting a significant performance jump in the benchmarks. Just a couple of minutes later I was staring at my screen looking at the numbers and was very surprised to see that the performance was even lower than on the presumably slower socket 754 mainboard. I double-checked the BIOS settings and everything looked fine until I decided to start CPU Z. Here, as you see, it reported AMD Athlon 64 3200 Plus, socket 939, 2 GHz and very important, frontside bus at 200 MHz. As I checked the memory tab, the tool said suddenly that the memory runs at only a half of the speed, at 100 MHz. It ran in dual mode and there were 2 GB of total memory set to quite optimistic timings, but it was still running at only 100 MHz. On the socket 754 mainboard, the memory was not running in dual mode, but with 200 MHz it was still faster. What would explain the performance drop on the new board? At that point, it was clear that there was something odd about my configuration. Luckily, CPU Z also provides SPD data read from the memory module's ROMs. And as you see in the slot 1, it reported G.Skill module and everything looked good. But in the second slot, I was surprised to see a Kingston module. The problem is that you need two identical memory modules to be able to get them into a stable dual mode. Even two equal memory modules produced on the different dates could run unstable. That's why the memory modules are usually sold in pairs to guarantee the required stability. So, what was wrong about my memory modules? I don't know anymore where I got those two modules from. I probably bought it together with some bunch of hardware one day. However, I guess I was blinded by the wrapping. First difference is that one module has a sticker with all the data on it. On the other module, the sticker was removed, but there are more differences. Take a look at the module's height. The one is obviously a little bit taller than the other one, so look what I found. The fancy cooler, I could simply pull off the module and it revealed a 1 GB Kingston DDR400 module indeed, which was of course not a good fit for the original G.Skill module to run in dual mode. I don't know the story of these modules, but probably someone just wrapped a Kingston memory module into a G.Skill cooler. Well, if you work with used and old hardware, such things happen all the time, so be careful what you get and double check the parts you obtain. So I went through my spare parts and found these two DDR400 modules, each 1 GB. They are some no-name modules with CL3 Hynix DRAM ICs, and first they also didn't want to work at full 200 MHz. Again, despite that in BIOS the memory clock was set to 200 MHz, CPU-Z in Windows reported 133 MHz dual mode, but at better timings as what the memory was rated at. I guess this mainboard basically treats the BIOS memory clock as a suggestion and not as a hard setting. Looks like it makes some tests and tries to use the better timings over higher memory clock. And obviously this memory can handle those strict timings only at 133 MHz. Anyway, this behavior can be changed in BIOS and the clock can be prioritized over timings. By the way, look how irritating the BIOS report can be, as it states to run the memory at 200 MHz, although we definitely saw in CPU-Z that it runs only at 133 MHz. Anyway, in advanced settings, CPU configuration, where the memory clock can be set, there is an entry called flexibility option. When enabled, this one tells the mainboard that we don't insist on strict settings for the memory clock, and it is allowed to find out what is the best automatically. After some tests, I found that the mainboard doesn't really seem to take the best setting, so I disabled that option and voila! CPU-Z reported that the memory was now running at 200 MHz in dual mode and at the proper timings, which were written into the SPD of the memory modules. I ran some benchmarks and the system turned out to be stable so far. The performance in many cases remained the same. Unfortunately, I didn't make a note of all of the tests, but I noticed that in many cases the performance gain was very low or not measurable at all compared to the old Socket 754 setup. Here are some examples. In 3D Mark 2001, the result went from 13,919 points to 14,851. That was one of the noticeable gains, and in Quake 2 and Doom 3, the FPS counter remained on the same level. That could only mean that the ATI X1650 graphics card was a bottleneck and limited the overall performance of the system. If you saw my last video about this build, you will remember that I put some extra love into refurbishing of this card. I like how it looks like, and I'm a little bit sad that it already hit its limits, but this one never pretended to be the fastest card, so it is a time to get another one. Fortunately, I already found a good replacement for only a couple of euros on eBay, and in the next video I will upgrade this system with a better GPU and make some benchmarks. So if you are interested to see how my Windows XP retro machine upgrade journey will continue, please stay tuned and join me in the next part. And as for this mainboard upgrade, I would say that it was a success so far. Despite of the loud fan issue, which I will fix as soon as possible, this ASRock 939 is a feature-rich AGP mainboard, probably one of the latest ones, and everything what I need works fine. Though I'm impressed how close the Socket 754 Asus board actually performed. With a single mode DDR and 200 MHz weaker CPU, it ran almost just as fast as the Socket 939 board in the most tests. Well, it was obviously limited by the GPU, but it was still not bad at all. Funny enough, the Asus board had also a fan speed control and was running nearly silent. However, the bugs and issues were quite annoying if you ask me. By the way, as I said, the ASRock 939 A8X supports up to 4 1GB memory modules, and I already could find these two Corsair Value Select memory kits. They are not the fastest, but they are usually quite reliable and new. Furthermore, it is not easy to find kits of 4 modules, and as I said, it is important to take the modules as similar as possible. Fortunately, these two kits were probably even produced on the same day, since the serial numbers are just by 170 apart. So I might have luck to get all of them running at 200 MHz in dual mode too, and that would make this machine even totally usable for today's simple tasks. And this is it for today. I'm glad to able to share my experience with you guys, and I would also like to know about similar upgrades from you. Maybe benchmark results, so I can compare these numbers to the ones which I will get, or some tips, or maybe there is something particular you would like to know about this setup. And so far, thank you and goodbye.